Okay, so this is where I am right now with the Kyosho Rampage Pro Electric conversion build series. So from the last video, what did I do? I mounted the servo, I mounted all the top deck pieces and the front and rear shocks. We'll start with the obvious here. As you can see, I used Kyosho big bore shocks. These are from the RB6 or the RB6.6. Same shock length, nothing special. I did use the medium shock eyelets on the bottom for both the front and rear. And what else did I do? Front, provisionally what I'm using are low-C blue front springs here. I think I have 32.5 weight up front with 2x1.6 pistons. I'm pretty sure, it's been a little while. And in the rear I have Kyosho gold springs with 27.5 weight oil and also I believe 2x1.6 pistons. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to mention about the electronics mounting here is actually two things. One is how to mount the battery, and the other is with the steering servo mounting. I always use a servo saver on as many of my RC cars as possible, even though modern servos are very strong. Really, it's not so much to protect the servo as it is to protect the steering rack on these vintage cars. Because, you know, even though you can still occasionally find parts for these cars, it's good if you can to try to preserve the original parts as much as possible. So I have just a conventional Kimbro servo saver here on a high-tech servo. And again, that's really designed just to protect the actual car itself, not so much the servo. As for the battery mounting, this is where it gets a little bit fun. So all of the parts here, as you see, these little plastic posts and this original plate here, this is all stock. So this plate was originally meant to mount the brake servo for the Nitro car. So the brake servo will go up here and you have a little horn with a rod that goes and operates the braking mechanism back here. Okay, but this is an electric conversion, so technically we don't need this piece here, but I wanted to keep it there in order to minimize chassis flex. Okay, so if you're driving on a high traction surface, then too much chassis flex makes the car a little wobbly. Also, too much chassis flex over time on metal chassis actually distorts the chassis. It'll tweak the chassis. So I want to minimize any possibility of that. So as much as possible, I would like to run, all the stock pieces if I can. Even though I don't actually need this piece on a functional level for electronics mounting. But that does raise some questions about how to actually mount a LiPo battery. Because if we look here, all right, we can see that the clearance to the LiPo is actually pretty much dead on toward the back if I decide to mount the battery toward the rear. And, I get a little bit clearance up front, which is fine. But the problem is this height is just low enough that if I try to push the battery in like this, straight from the side, okay, the lip on the chassis is just enough to basically make the battery get stuck here. So if I wanted to mount the battery towards the rear, I'd either have to push it in on the front side like so, and then push it back like that, or I would have to plop it down like this and then kind of rotate it in. The problem is with either of those approaches, I still have to have a receiver and a speed control mounted somewhere, presumably, say, up in the front here. There won't be any space to play either of those tricks with the battery because I'd be protruding into the space that the other electronics require. Especially if I go, forward like this, this also protrudes into the space that the motor is using. Maybe there's a little clearance there. So really what I have to do is either A, Dremel down this lip here on the chassis, which I really don't want to do. Again, I want to keep the chassis as original as possible. Or B, remove this plate or perhaps add some spacers under each of these posts here. So there's this post here, there's that post there. There's also this piece here this other plate that it mounts on. So I could just keep adding washers or spacers, or maybe even just, simple 3mm nuts, like these little guys, under between on these screws between, say, this plate and this plate. Just keep using little nuts there, and same thing, here between this plate and this post. And I may have to use progressively longer screws to pick up that slack, and to just basically rise this plate just enough so that I can slide the battery in from the side and have enough clearance from this lip to slot everything in place. And, maybe I'll put like an RC10 battery cup here just to hold everything in, to keep the battery from sliding around too much. I'll have to figure that out. So the battery mounting is going to be a little tricky. Probably going to use some kind of spacers here, okay, which will allow me to do that, while at the same time, minimizing chassis flex, maintaining all the stock parts on the chassis as possible. And then that's pretty much it. After that, I have to paint the body, which will be a while before I paint the body for a variety of reasons. But mounting the body is another thing I want to really think about, because conventionally you have this little lip right here with a body clip hole on the rear shock tower, and then on the front bulkhead sort of cap, if you will, or this top plate, there's another body clip mounting post right here. So we just put the body on and use those two clips and call it a day. But then the body can still kind of flop around side to side. So I like to use these two lips in some way, maybe some Velcro tape to really hold the body down. The problem is that these lips are fairly curved, and they don't go very high up. If they went a little higher up, then I'd have more sidewall to actually mount some Velcro tape. As they are right now, there'd be quite a bit of exposure to, dirt or whatever the racing surface is that could rub against this, and over time pull that Velcro tape off. So maybe what I'll have to do is, make little extensions, like Lexan extensions or something, on the front and rear, and then put Velcro tape there to mount the body. We'll see about that. First things first, I want to try to mount the electronics. The other thing with the original body is that it's a truly old school Lexan body, in that there's no protective film on the exterior of the body. So you have to do quite a lot more masking to those older bodies than you do with a modern body from Proline or J Concepts or whoever. So it'll just take more time to paint. So that's more or less it, as far as building the chassis goes. This is a pretty straightforward build. All I really did was just clean it all up, build a new gearbox, make a few modifications to the drivetrain to do the electric conversion, put big bore shocks on it, and that's basically it. I think it goes together pretty nicely. I like the fact that the rear shocks mount behind the rear axle. That should give me a little bit more rear grip. I like the fact that, these older Kyosho wing mounts have adjustable wing angle. That's really cool. I like that on a vintage car I have adjustable rear hub carrier placement. I have quite a lot of roll center and camber gain options, definitely more than I would on, say, conventional RC10. Also, plenty of shock angle and height options on both the front and rear tower. So there's a fair amount of tunability here, although this is not the most tunable among the vintage platforms. I think the Traxxas TRX3 is probably the most tunable vintage two-wheel drive buggy platform. But this should be really cool. So that's essentially it. At least until I get all the electronics mounted and the body painted, I won't be making any new videos on this. So thanks for watching.